September 14, 1940, the Imperial Navy Ministry. Tokyo, through the tall windows of the briefing room. Autumn shadows stretch across polished oak tables where the fate of empires hangs. Suspended like smoke from ceremonial incense, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stands before a wall-mounted map of the Pacific, his weathered finger tracing the vast blue expanse between Japan and America while his colleagues shift uncomfortably in their chairs. The air carries the weight of unspoken tensions and the faint aroma of green tea cooling in forgotten cups. Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas, Yamamoto says with quiet certainty that cuts through the room's ceremonial silence, knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America. The words fall into the stillness like stones dropped into deep water, their ripples spreading through minds that refuse to acknowledge what their most brilliant strategist has witnessed firsthand outside. Tokyo's streets hum with citizens preparing for a war they believe Japan cannot lose, unaware that their greatest admiral has already calculated the mathematical certainty of their defeat. This moment crystallizes one of history's most profound tragedies. The man who possessed the clearest vision of American industrial might was destined to become the architect of Japan's most spectacular victory and most catastrophic strategic blunder for over 2 years. Yamamoto had served as an unwelcome prophet in Japan's military councils, delivering assessments that contradicted every comfortable assumption about Japanese superiority and American weakness. His warnings emerged not from theoretical calculations, but from intimate knowledge of American abundance gained through years of residence, study, and careful observation in the United States. While his colleagues constructed elaborate fantasies about defeating America through spiritual superiority and tactical brilliance, Yamamoto possessed something far more dangerous to their illusions: actual understanding of the industrial colossus that Japan was preparing to challenge. The emotional contrast between what Japan's military leadership expected from war with America and what Yamamoto knew awaited them created a psychological chasm that would prove unbridgeable. His fellow officers envisioned a conflict where Japanese courage would overcome American material advantages, where Bushido's spirit would triumph over Western mechanical thinking, where decisive early victories would force American negotiators to accept Japanese terms rather than endure prolonged warfare. They imagined Americans as soft, luxury-loving people who would recoil from serious casualties, who lacked the spiritual fortitude for extended conflict, who would choose compromise over commitment when faced with determined Japanese resistance. These expectations rested on cultural prejudices and racial superiority theories that had never encountered the reality of American industrial democracy mobilized for total war. Yamamoto's knowledge came from direct experience that shattered every assumption his colleagues held sacred. From 1919 to 1921, he had studied at Harvard University, walking through Cambridge neighborhoods where American intellectuals casually discussed industrial projects that exceeded Japan's national budgets. He had toured the River Rouge plant in Detroit, watching Henry Ford's assembly lines produce more automobiles in a single day than Japanese factories manufactured in months. He had witnessed oil derricks in Texas pumping daily volumes that surpassed Japan's strategic petroleum reserves. Most crucially, he had observed the matter-of-fact efficiency with which Americans approached massive undertakings, the infrastructure that could support such enterprises without strain, the cultural confidence that treated enormous challenges as routine problems, requiring only systematic solutions. During his subsequent posting as naval attached to Washington from 1925 to 1927, Yamamoto had compiled intelligence reports that painted a picture of American capacity so vast that his superiors dismissed them as propaganda or fantasy. His documentation of American aircraft manufacturing showed production rates that Japanese planners considered impossible. His surveys of American shipyards revealed construction capabilities that the Imperial Navy deemed exaggerated. Western boasts His analysis of American steel production indicated output levels that Japanese strategists labeled as deliberate misinformation designed to intimidate. Yet Yamamoto had walked through these facilities, had spoken with foremen who discussed massive production schedules as routine challenges, had witnessed the casual abundance that characterized American industrial operations. Historical evidence of Yamamoto's prescience appears throughout his correspondence and documented statements during the period leading to Pearl Harbor, in meetings with Prince Kanoi throughout 1940 and early 1941. He repeatedly warned that Japan could sustain aggressive operations for perhaps 6 months before American production advantages would make continued resistance hopeless. His famous assessment, delivered with mathematical precision, rings with prophetic clarity. If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second and third years. This was not cautious pessimism, but informed calculation based on direct observation of American productive capacity that his colleagues had never witnessed. The dismissive response that greeted Yamamoto's warnings throughout 1940 and 1941 reflected institutional arrogance that mistook wishful thinking for strategic analysis. Senior officers who had built their careers on the mythology of Japanese spiritual superiority found his statistics inconvenient and his conclusions defeatist. When Yamamoto presented data showing American steel production exceeding Japan's entire industrial output by ratios of 10-to-1, the Naval General Staff dismissed such figures as Western propaganda designed to discourage Japanese ambitions. When he calculated American shipbuilding capacity in terms that suggested the United States could replace Japan's entire navy annually while maintaining civilian production, his fellow admirals labeled these assessments as fantasies conjured by excessive exposure to American culture. The symbolic power of chocolate would later haunt Japanese soldiers throughout the Pacific War, representing abundance so profound that it redefined their understanding of industrial warfare. American sea rations contained Hershey's D bars and other confections that individual soldiers consumed casually, while Japanese troops hoarded single rice balls as precious sustenance. These chocolate bars embodied more than superior logistics. They represented an economy that could afford to send luxury items to combat zones, supply lines so robust that they carried non-essential goods across thousands of miles of ocean, industrial capacity so vast that treating soldiers to confections seemed routine rather than extraordinary. The chocolate became a symbol of the abundance Yamamoto had tried to warn Japan about confronting. By late 1940, as diplomatic relations deteriorated and military pressure mounted for decisive action against Western powers, Yamamoto found himself in the impossible position of opposing war while being ordered to plan for victory. His colleagues demanded strategies for defeating America without acknowledging the industrial mathematics that made such victory impossible. They wanted tactical brilliance that could overcome strategic impossibility, military solutions to problems that transcended military capabilities. Yamamoto understood that Japan faced not merely a stronger opponent, but a different category of adversary entirely, a continental empire whose productive capacity operated on scales that island-bound leaders could not comprehend. The oil embargo imposed by the United States in August 1941 validated every concern Yamamoto had expressed about American economic leverage, while his colleagues raged against this act as proof of Western cowardice and desperation. Yamamoto recognized it as a demonstration of exactly the kind of strategic thinking that made America so formidable. The embargo was not American weakness but precision, a surgical application of economic pressure that would force Japan into precisely the kind of prolonged conflict that would expose every vulnerability. Yamamoto had identified America was not afraid of war. It was confident enough in its industrial superiority to provoke war on terms that guaranteed American victory. through mathematical inevitability rather than military genius as Japan's. Leadership demanded plans for breaking the economic siege through military action. Yamamoto complied with the fatalistic resignation of a man ordered to design his own execution. The Pearl Harbor attack plan embodied this tragic paradox, tactically brilliant, strategically suicidal. He understood that success would achieve everything the Naval General Staff wanted while guaranteeing everything he feared. The attack would cripple America's Pacific Fleet while simultaneously awakening American industrial might. It would eliminate immediate threats to Japanese expansion while ensuring that those threats would return multiplied beyond Japanese capacity to resist. Victory would doom Japan more certainly than defeat. By triggering American productive fury that no amount of Japanese courage could overcome, the Naval General Staff's initial rejection of Yamamoto's Pearl Harbor plan reflected their discomfort with operations that required such extensive resource commitment for such uncertain strategic gain. They preferred conventional approaches that matched their understanding of naval warfare. Traditional battles where Japanese tactical superiority could achieve decisive results without risking the empire's entire carrier force in a single desperate gamble. Their opposition forced Yamamoto to employ the ultimate weapon in Japanese military politics, the threat of resignation. His ultimatum worked because the Naval General Staff understood that losing their most capable strategist would leave Japan's war planning in the hands of men who possessed neither his tactical genius nor his strategic vision. However unwelcome that vision might prove, the emotional transformation that followed Yamamoto's threat revealed the psychological dynamics that governed Japanese military decision-making throughout the war. Faced with losing their most brilliant commander, the Naval General Staff chose to authorize an operation they considered too risky, rather than confront the institutional crisis that Yamamoto's resignation would create. This decision established a pattern that would repeat throughout the Pacific War, choosing tactical expedients over strategic wisdom, preferring comfortable illusions to uncomfortable truths, avoiding difficult decisions until circumstances made them inevitable. Yamamoto's success in forcing approval of Pearl Harbor demonstrated both his tactical brilliance and the institutional weakness that would doom Japan to strategic disaster throughout the summer and autumn of 1941. As Yamamoto refined his plans for Pearl Harbor, he carried the psychological burden of designing Japan's most spectacular victory and most catastrophic mistake simultaneously. His private correspondence during this period reveals a man wrestling with the implications of his own genius. Knowing that tactical perfection would serve strategic disaster, letters to friends and family members carried undertones of fatalistic resignation. The measured words of a man watching a beloved country march toward destruction with flags flying and bands playing. He had become Japan's most successful planner and its most reluctant prophet, achieving operational brilliance while witnessing strategic catastrophe unfold exactly as his calculations predicted. December 7, 1941, dawned clear and quiet over Pearl Harbor, the Hawaiian sun casting long shadows across battleships that would soon burn like funeral pyres for Japanese strategic hopes. At 7:55 a.m., as the first bombs began falling and the first American ships started listing into their death spirals, Yamamoto sat in his flagship hundreds of miles away, writing letters that revealed none of the triumph his officers expected. His private correspondence spoke not of victory but of dread, not of American weakness but of the terrible industrial resolve he knew was about to be unleashed. While Japanese pilots returned to their carriers celebrating perfect tactical success, Yamamoto understood that perfection had guaranteed Japan's eventual destruction through awakening the very forces he had spent years warning against. The immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor seemed to vindicate Japanese optimism while confirming Yamamoto's darkest fears. As Japanese forces swept across the Pacific in an intoxicating series of victories, Wake Island falling after heroic but futile resistance, Hong Kong surrendering after brief siege, Singapore capitulating despite massive British garrison. The American response was already gathering momentum in ways that Japanese intelligence failed to grasp. While Japanese newspapers celebrated unbroken strings of military triumphs, American factories were retooling from civilian to military production with efficiency that exceeded even Yamamoto's pessimistic projections. The chocolate bars that would soon appear in American supply dumps told stories of industrial transformation that Japanese leaders could not begin to comprehend. The statistical reality of American industrial mobilization unfolded with mathematical inevitability throughout 1942. Validating every calculation, Yamamoto had presented to skeptical colleagues aircraft production climbed from 19,433 planes in 1941 to 47,836 in 1942, then to 85,898 in 1943, reaching 96,318 in 1944, numbers that represented not just quantitative superiority but qualitative transformation of warfare itself. American shipyards launched Liberty ships at rates averaging 15 vessels per day throughout the war, with peak production exceeding 100 ships per month. During 1943, the 2,710 Liberty ships completed between 1941 and 1945 represented more tonnage than Japan possessed in its entire merchant marine. By early 1943, the chocolate bars found in captured American positions carried psychological impact that extended far beyond their nutritional value. Individual American soldiers carried emergency rations that exceeded Japanese battalion food allocations. American pilots flew training missions consuming fuel quantities that Japanese squadrons hoarded for combat operations. American mechanics discarded spare parts that Japanese technicians would have treasured for weeks. This abundance was not merely superior logistics, but evidence of industrial capacity, so vast that it treated military operations as routine applications of overwhelming material force rather than exercises in careful resource management. Yamamoto's assassination on April 18, 1943, eliminated the one Japanese leader who had fully grasped the implications of American industrial awakening. The P-38 Lightning fighters that intercepted his bomber over Bougainville were themselves symbols of American productive capacity. Sophisticated aircraft manufactured in quantities Japanese planners still considered impossible, flown by pilots trained on fuel allocations that exceeded Japanese squadron budgets, guided by intelligence gathered through communication intercepts that revealed American technological sophistication. His death marked not just the loss of Japan's most capable naval strategist, but the silencing of the voice that had warned most clearly about the consequences of awakening American industrial democracy. The transformation in Japanese military thinking that followed Yamamoto's death revealed how completely his warnings had been vindicated by events officers who had dismissed his pre-war assessments of American productive capacity now witnessed evidence that exceeded his most pessimistic calculations. The chocolate bars scattered across Pacific battlefields became symbols of abundance so profound that Japanese soldiers could not comprehend its implications. These confections represented not just superior supply lines, but an economy that could afford to treat luxury as routine. Military issue. Industrial capacity that operated beyond the imagination of leaders trained to think in terms of scarcity and careful rationing. Final 2 years of the Pacific War unfolded as systematic validation of every principle Yamamoto had articulated. In his unheeded warnings, American forces advanced across the Pacific, not through superior courage, though courage was evident, but through overwhelming material application that made resistance ultimately mathematical rather than tactical. Japanese strongholds fell to American attacks that enjoyed advantages in ammunition, fuel, replacement equipment, and reserve personnel so profound that individual heroism could not overcome statistical inevitability. Each defeat confirmed the industrial mathematics that Yamamoto had calculated with prophetic accuracy years before the first shot was fired. American production statistics for the complete war period read like vindication of Yamamoto's most dire predictions. The United States produced 297,000 aircraft compared to Japan's 76,000, a ratio of nearly 4-to-1 that reflected not just greater capacity but superior organization of that capacity. American shipbuilding completed over 5,000 major vessels during the war while Japan struggled to replace losses at fractions of American construction rates. American tank production reached 102,000 units while Japan manufactured barely 4,000, revealing industrial disparities that made prolonged conflict hopeless from the beginning. The chocolate that sustained American forces throughout these campaigns embodied the abundance that had made such production possible. The atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 represented the ultimate expression of American industrial and scientific integration that Yamamoto had observed during his Harvard years. The Manhattan Project embodied everything he had warned about: American technological capacity, the ability to mobilize intellectual talent from around the world, to commit resources to speculative research projects that exceeded Japan's military budgets, to translate theoretical physics into practical weapons with efficiency that demonstrated complete mastery of industrial processes. The uranium and plutonium that destroyed 2 cities had been refined through operations, requiring more electrical power than Japan's entire grid could generate in the final accounting. Every prediction Yamamoto had made proved conservative rather than alarmist. American aircraft production had exceeded his worst-case projections. American shipbuilding had surpassed his most detailed calculations. American technological development had advanced faster than his most comprehensive assessments. The 6 months of Japanese victories he had promised stretched to 18 months. But the ultimate outcome remained exactly as he had foreseen: total defeat through mathematical certainty rather than military incompetence. His colleagues who had dismissed his warnings about American chocolate rations now witnessed American occupation forces distributing confections to hungry Japanese civilians with casual generosity that illustrated the abundance gap he had tried to explain. Deeper tragedy of Japan's Pacific War lay not in military defeat, which mathematics had made inevitable once American production reached full capacity, but in the willful blindness that prevented Japanese leaders from accepting wisdom that could have guided them toward diplomatic alternatives. Yamamoto's warnings had offered roadmaps for avoiding catastrophe, clear-eyed assessments of American strength that could have informed negotiated strategies, preserving Japanese interests without triggering total war. The dismissive response that met his concerns represented more than institutional arrogance. It embodied cultural pride that prevented island-bound leaders from understanding the Industrial Revolution that had transformed global warfare forever. The chocolate bars that American occupation forces shared with defeated Japanese civilians after surrender carried more nutritional value than Japanese soldiers had received during combat operations. The medical supplies that American doctors used to treat Japanese patients exceeded pharmaceutical resources available to Japan's entire military medical system. The gasoline that American jeeps burned in routine patrols consumed more fuel than Japanese aircraft had available for final desperate missions. Every gesture of American generosity toward defeated Japan illustrated resource disparities that Yamamoto had recognized and that Japanese leadership had fatally underestimated. The ultimate irony of Yamamoto's story lies in the precision with which every prediction was fulfilled. His 6 months of victories lasted exactly as promised. American industrial mobilization proceeded faster than he had warned. Japanese resource limitations proved more severe than he had calculated. Strategic outcomes matched his most pessimistic assessments with accuracy that validated his understanding while condemning his country to destruction. He had remained Japan's most perceptive strategist and most tragic prophet. seeing clearly the future that others refuse to acknowledge, serving faithfully an empire whose leaders chose comfortable illusions over inconvenient truths. Admiral Yamamoto's greatest service to Japan was not the tactical brilliance that won Pearl Harbor, but the strategic wisdom that predicted its ultimate meaninglessness. His warnings, dismissed by colleagues who confused temporary success with permanent advantage, offered final opportunities for Japanese leadership to avoid catastrophe that industrial mathematics made inevitable. The Pacific burned exactly as he had foreseen, not because American fighting spirit exceeded Japanese courage, but because American abundance had transformed courage itself into another raw material deployable in overwhelming quantities. The chocolate that sustained American forces throughout the conflict symbolized this abundant sweetness born of industrial plenty, strength rooted not in spiritual superiority, but in organized prosperity. The fires that consumed the Pacific from 1941 to 1945 burned brightest in the aftermath of institutional deafness that dismissed prophetic warnings for comfortable fantasies. In those flames, Japan discovered differences between tactical brilliance and strategic wisdom, between courage and industrial capacity, between fighting spirit and productive mathematics. Yamamoto had tried to teach these lessons before war began, when knowledge might have prevented catastrophe. Instead, he became both architect of Japan's greatest victory and witness to inevitable defeat. That victory guaranteed a man whose warnings, ignored in peacetime, proved prophetic in total war's crucible, where wisdom speaks eternal truths that only hindsight allows us to hear. The chocolate bars scattered across 1,000 Pacific battlefields remain monuments to abundance that no amount of valor could overcome, sweetness that testified to industrial democracy's ultimate triumph over dreams built on pride rather than reality.